Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the live show, everybody. Which we are doing, we've restarted. We're doing every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Not the last 2 weeks because summer, things getting in the way, various problems. It's a tricky time. Obviously, the glorious weather as well. Absolutely blessed with that. Although we are actually having a very nice day today, which is a shame because obviously we had the show today. So I'm going to try and get some. I hope you also, it's sunny where you are, because that is essentially the end of the summer. What we're going to talk about today is the latest descent into the sewer by our ruling party, the Conservative Party. Now, they are in a desperate state. Their polling is calamitous. We'll talk about that later after I've spoken to my two guests. Now, what they're doing, the Tories, quite clearly, in terms of their zealous and bigoted and increasingly deranged focus on migrants and refugees, and an onslaught against our human rights collectively, I should say, it's a sign of desperation. An age-old, I suppose, tactic by administrations, governments, regimes in desperate circumstances is to deploy fear, to deflect growing popular anger away from powerful targets to vulnerable minorities who are scapegoated for the ills in society. Now, the Tories have deliberately stoked up a particular panic about the arrival of migrants and refugees on small boats. Now, this is interesting because we have fewer asylum claims than the beginning of the century, but more people arriving on small boats because of the closure of safe and legal routes. The Tories have really put themselves in a terrible situation, I would say. I'm not sure, as master strategists, which in the past they have been, that power's clearly waned, because what they've done is they've deliberately inflamed the idea of the small boats. They've started this kind of their campaign of stop the boats, stop the boats. That's not going to happen. In no way under this government. Doesn't matter what they're going to do. These small boats are always going to arrive. So what they've done is inflame a problem or inflame the idea of a problem, inflame the idea of a crisis, which they're not able to themselves solve. So they really have put themselves in a disastrous position. But that, of course, there are consequences. There are consequences in terms of people fleeing often desperate circumstances and the way they're treated. And we can see that at the moment, being placed in this barge with less living space than a parking lot. And we can see the Rwanda scheme. We can see the desperate way that, or the horrendous way that many migrants and refugees are being treated, the way that racists on the streets are emboldened by the sorts of rhetoric we hear from the government and from the media. So obviously big consequences that we need to discuss. But it's worth just unpicking exactly what they're doing and also the myths, because they're using the bully pulpit of government and the media to propagate a series of myths and outright lies, which we are going to dispel. Now, before I bring in my guests, as ever, if you're watching live, do click on the link, on the YouTube link to talk so we can have a chat. You can put super chats to our guest. I will thank everyone at the end. And also, you can support the channel that way. You can support us on patreon.com/everyday84. That's how you keep the show on the road. Glad to say that our content is reaching a huge number of people on YouTube. 1.5 to 2 million hits a month. On Facebook, similar. Also on the podcast. On Instagram, hundreds of thousands of views. So we are reaching a very, very large number of people. That's all thanks to you. You keep the show on the road. And we wouldn't be able to reach such a huge number of people without your active support. So do keep supporting us if you can. Now, I'm going to bring in straight away Leila Zadeh, who is the Executive Director of Rainbow Migration, who do absolutely brilliant work. Do look up Rainbow Migration and support them if you can. Hey, Leila, how you doing?
Hi, Owen. I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. Right, there might be a slight delay here, but we're going to persevere. What I'm going to do is just play a quick clip from the Today programme, and this is a government minister responding to Lee Anderson, who is the deputy chair of the Conservative Party, telling migrants to F off back to France. Let's just have a listen.
You're being careful with your language this morning. The Conservative Deputy Chairman Lee Anderson has said to the Daily Express of these migrants, if they don't like barges, then they should F off back to France. Is that the Conservatives' policy?
Well, Lee is expressing in salty terms, I think, something that people well understand, which is that the British people have warm hearts, but we also want to have a secure front door. And it is not right that people who behave illegally, and incidentally, it has been illegal to arrive in this way for 50 years or so, to jump the queue compared to those who have played by the rules and done the right things.
Should they F off back to France, as he suggests?
Well, as I say, Lee has expressed himself in his own way, but the central point that he's making, is not unreasonable.
Many people listening don't know you well. You've become Justice Secretary relatively recently, replacing Dominic Raab. Now, you said a few years ago that you believed that Britain was a, quote, tolerant, outward-facing nation.
Yeah.
And you denounced people using rhetoric you didn't like as an excuse for ugly bigotry I thought we'd left long behind. Do you think telling people to F off back to France, who might have genuine claims to be asylum seekers, who might have escaped war and persecution, do you think that is the reflection of a tolerant, outward-facing nation?
I think that, look, this is absolutely fine. I've no difficulty with that. It's not bigotry at all. This country, lest we forget, has offered its home to 400,000 people since 2015. So Ukrainians, people from Hong Kong, which I have in my own constituency in Cheltenham, Afghans, we are an open and warm and outward-facing country. But equally, we're a country that believes in fairness and playing by the rules. And those who don't play by the rules, who don't take advantage of those opportunities we provide and try to jump the queue, rightly cause indignation. And I think Lee was expressing that indignation in his own way, but there was nothing unreasonable in principle about what he was saying.
Leila, I just want your response, firstly, to a government minister defending calling it salty, the way that the deputy chairman of the Conservative Party told migrants and refugees to F off back to France.
I've heard this a few times now, and even just as you replayed it now, I took a sharp intake of breath, because that language is the kind of words that I grew up with in this country, being told to go back to where you came from. And it's what this language does is it makes a lot of us, whether we're people of colour or like me, for example, I grew up as part of a refugee family in this country, be told that we're not welcome. And I think this government's actually got it wrong, because my experience is most people welcome refugees. They're right that thousands of people opened up their homes to welcome Ukrainians, and most people want to help. So it's really unhelpful that this government is using rhetoric like that.
In terms of, he talks about jumping the queue. I'm just interested in what you think about this idea that those arriving in small boats are those jumping the queue ahead of those with so-called legitimate claims. That's what he says.
Well, there is no orderly queue, so to speak of. People take dangerous journeys to this country because they have no other option. Nobody does this because they think it's the best way, or that because they willingly want to take risks with their lives. The fact is that outside of the Ukraine scheme, it's very difficult to get here through a safe route. And the reason why people are taking boats is because successive governments have made it harder and harder to get to the UK. And every time they close a route, people are forced into more dangerous alternatives. And what the latest measures will do is not stop people coming by boat, but they will find other, even more dangerous ways to get here.
I mean, when we're talking, it's quite interesting, obviously, the focus on those arriving on small boats. And Lee Anderson responded yesterday, defending his comments by describing them as fit young men arriving. That's the way it's being portrayed, basically, as opposed to refugees from other demographics. I mean, what was your response to him coming out swinging in that way?
I mean, I think it's unfortunate that when you feel something that really hurts, that you get somebody defending their statement. And the fact is that, very small numbers of refugees globally actually come to this country. And most of us welcome refugees, and this government is out of sentiment with that. And they need to be tapping into what the public actually feels, which is helping people to rebuild their lives in this country.
I mean, when we're talking about those who arrive here, I went to Calais a few years ago when there was the camp there, and I spoke to refugees there. And it was very striking that those arriving here, they largely spoke English. So those from former French colonies tended to go to France, and those. So I mean, I'm just interested in, because when the vast majority of refugees, around 70%, go to their neighbouring countries. The vast majority, a large majority of displaced people stay in their own country. Those who become refugees and leave their country, the 70% are in neighbouring countries, which tend to be poor. Most countries hosting refugees are poor or middle-income countries. But is that right? The people coming here tend to be disproportionately those with some sort of, they used to be in a British colony, for example.
It is true that a lot of people who seek asylum in the UK have connections to this country. I can give the example of my own family. My mum and dad were here as students, and then they went back to Iran when they, finished their studies, and it was time for them to go back. They faced persecution there, and they had to leave for their own safety. And the UK was the obvious place for them to come. They already spoke English. They knew the systems here. They had friends here. My dad had a brother here. So it is true that there's a lot of historical connections. And we work at Rainbow Migration with LGBTQI plus people who are seeking asylum. And certainly a lot of people that we work with do come from Commonwealth countries where they have had laws imposed by the former British colonial power that criminalizes same-sex relations.
Which is very interesting. That's a, hold on one second. I think it was a slight echo there. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because so many of these former colonies, Africa and elsewhere, have Victorian era homophobic pieces of legislation imposed by the British Empire, and then people are fleeing that homophobia to the former colonizers, I suppose. I'm just interested as well. I mean, the Rwanda. So just talking about Rwanda at the moment, the focus on deporting people of any background and circumstance. It's very interesting because the polling suggests that if you ask people, regardless of circumstance, regardless of what persecution you've suffered from, should there be a blanket deportation to Rwanda? There isn't public support for that, is there? But I'm just interested in what you think about this idea of Rwanda, that whole so-called scheme being used as a deterrence. That's the argument being used by its defenders.
Well, I think the Rwanda scheme, or the latest touted plan about sending people to Ascension Island, really go against our human values of being kind and compassionate. And just imagine that you've gone somewhere, in this case to the UK, frightened for your life, and all you want to do is build a future for yourself where you have hope and where you can be safe, only to be told you're going to be sent to somewhere thousands of miles away that you've never heard of. It's not right for anyone at all. And for LGBT plus people, it's particularly scary because even on the Foreign Office website, it does recognize that there are risks to LGBT plus people in Rwanda. And yet we've raised this with the government, but they are determined to press ahead regardless.
Can I ask you just a couple of other questions? Can I ask you, could you give some examples of stories of the sorts of refugees that you work with and the sorts of experiences that they've had?
Yeah, we worked with one person called Adams, who's a bisexual man from Ghana. He and his partner were caught together in Ghana, and he fled to the UK. He actually came here on a valid visa in his case. But when he got here, he found out that his partner had been killed. His asylum claim was rejected because the government didn't believe that he was bisexual. With our support, we managed to get him his leave to remain here eventually, and he's now rebuilding his life. But he's still overcoming not only the trauma that he went through in his country of origin, but the fact that in this country, he was locked away. He was put inside a detention center, and he's still reliving the damage that did that during that time when his freedom was taken from him and he was locked up.
Just finally, what can people do? I mean, people might be hearing these, I think just from a general political perspective, it's clear the Conservatives feel they're in a desperate place politically and electorally. They're throwing everything at this because they think they can mobilise their base on the issue of fear about migrants and refugees. What's your kind of suggestion for people who are kind of feeling frustrated? What can people do? I know there are people who've taken in, my brother taking in Ukrainian refugees. So you mentioned those examples, but there is a scheme there in place. But what's the sorts of general things you're asking people to do?
I would encourage people to write to their MPs of any political party because they are there to represent us and they do listen. You might remember when the scheme came in 2015 to help settle refugees from the Syria region in this country, that was in response to widespread populist support. So people who support refugees, we all need to make our voices louder and clearer and better known to our representatives in Parliament. And I am from Rainbow Migration, so I would also suggest that people can sign up to our mailing list, where we do tell people when there are particular campaign actions that they can take.
Great stuff. I really, really appreciate it, by the way, Leila, just you joining us and talking about it. And huge support for everything Rainbow Migration is doing. I hope people look them up and support you in lots of in any way they can. But really, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great stuff there from Leila. It's so important that we support people on the front line who are doing everything they can to support refugees and migrants. Leila herself from a refugee background, as she says. Now, we're going to talk more about, in terms of the legal perspective, on what the government are doing in terms of government refugees and migrants, but also the European Court of Human Rights, which they're talking about leaving. Let's bring in June Pang from Liberty, the human rights organisation who do brilliant work defending people's civil rights, which are obviously under attack by the Conservative government. June, great to speak to you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's a big honour. So, yeah, we can see, Tories could campaign to leave European Human Rights Treaty if Rwanda flights blocked. Firstly, I mean, just explain kind of quickly what, as best you can. When we talk about this treaty, what are we talking about? What are the rights it enshrines? Where did it come from? How did we end up signing up to it?
Absolutely. So the European Convention on Human Rights is a decades-old human rights instrument that was, it's actually originated from an idea of Winston Churchill, and it was drafted in large part by British lawyers after World War II to prevent the atrocities that were committed from ever happening again. And it's the key human rights instrument of what's called the Council of Europe. Importantly, the Council of Europe is different to the European Union, and it basically enshrines all of the protections that we take for granted every day, whether it's our right to freedom of expression, right to privacy, right to religious freedom, all of these things, enshrines that in the UK and protects all of us. And so it's incredibly staggering, really, and reckless and desperate to see the government trying to suggest that it would rip up these fundamental rights for what are essentially cheap political points.
So, I mean, they're talking about the Rwanda scheme. What's happened legally with Rwanda in terms of as people may know, this agreement with Rwanda, which is ruled by a regime which doesn't abide by human rights, to have a blanket deportation of everyone who arrives by small boats to Rwanda. Just to explain, what's the kind of legal position as things stand with that whole scheme?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Rwanda scheme being, as cruel and fundamentally unworkable as it is, I think first really attracted kind of government anger and ire, especially when essentially the European Court of Human Rights, which is in charge of enforcing the European Convention on Human Rights, again, separate to the EU, issued what is called an interim order to stop the first Rwanda flights from happening, because essentially it would have caused irreversible harm to people who would have been scheduled to be on that flight. And many people may remember that was quite a dramatic moment, and it was a combination of legal advocacy and direct action that ended up ensuring that no one was on that first flight to Rwanda. And most recently, the Court of Appeal has vindicated the campaigners who fought against that, who are fighting against that plan. Obviously, it continues, in asserting that Rwanda is not a safe country to remove people to because of human rights abuses that might happen to people there. And the government has decided to appeal that judgment. And so I think that the Supreme Court will be considering it later in the fall. But I think fundamentally, why the conversation has become so toxic is basically this targeting of refugees and migrants' rights as a way to, well, in and of itself, because that is, as you said in the introduction, one way to restrict everyone's rights, to basically target the rights of a minority to begin with. But it's now become also this wider thing about whether or not we should stay in the ECHR, which again protects everyone's rights and is much wider than just this particular issue.
And I mean, in terms of what's the legality, is it possible to just withdraw, and what kind of company would that leave us with?
I mean, it is possible to withdraw. I think my hesitation with saying that is that it would truly be unfathomable, at least. And one thing I often talk about with my colleagues is that the Overton window about the acceptability of even talking about withdrawing has really shifted in the last, I would even say half a year. I was just looking back, and in October of last year, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was chastised by the government for basically saying that it's her personal view that we should leave the ECHR. She said this at Conservative Party conference. But in recent months, we've really seen an escalation in the government adopting an increasingly hard line on the ECHR, which is, again, incredibly dangerous, because the ECHR is the foundation of all of our human rights protections in this country. And to kind of bandy around the idea that we could leave it is something that, none of us should accept. And indeed, many people within the Conservative Party itself disagree with it from all stripes, whether it's Bob Neill or Robert Buckland, Jackie Doyle-Price, Richard Graham, David Simmons. All these people are very different in terms of their, ideological positions and what have you. But, most people agree it's a bad idea to leave this essential human rights instrument.
I mean, when Conservatives and those on the right say that it's a threat to British sovereignty and that we could devise our own systems, what would you say to that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that, again, to kind of harken back to the history of the ECHR being a fundamentally British invention, that we actually had a massive role to play in designing it and being an architect of it. And we're much more powerful within it than we are without, because while we are in the European Court and within the jurisdiction of the European Court and within a signatory to the ECHR, our courts, our judges, our legal system can have a positive impact on the development of rights across the countries of the Council of Europe. If we leave the ECHR, we join the likes of Belarus and Russia, which some people say is hyperbolic or exaggerated. But I think it's really important to also say that in abandoning our obligations and in abandoning something that we were so integral to creating, we're actually setting an incredibly dangerous precedent in the wider world of countries just abnegating any responsibility for human rights, domestically as well as internationally. And we're already taking steps towards this, in the Illegal Migration Act that was most recently passed was part of that. But, even noises of leaving the ECHR would deal a death blow to our international reputation and also our credibility when speaking about human rights abuses abroad.
I mean, in terms of our international legal responsibilities at the moment, in terms of migrants and refugees, where would you say that we currently stand, legally speaking?
I mean, I mentioned the Illegal Migration Act that's just passed. Now, I think the first thing to say that, some people may not know is that the government itself acknowledged that the act is likely incompatible or it could not confirm that it wasn't incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. And it did this explicitly and it does so very rarely, and this was the rare occasion in which it did. And so it itself acknowledges that the Act doesn't comply with international law. The UNHCR, so the UN High Commissioner on Refugees in charge of refugee policy internationally, have said that the Act effectively extinguishes the right to asylum in the UK, apart from for a very small number of people. And more than that, it overturns judicial precedent in terms of how long people can be detained. It enables the detention of children. It introduces a massive expansion of the detention regime. It allows ministers to basically decide to ignore judgments of the European Court or interim measures of the European Court. And, all of these things are in this incredibly noxious piece of legislation that passed in a matter of months, even though it has such an unprecedented impact on the rule of law and international obligations. And it really, it's hard to describe just how dangerous it is and how worrying a precedent it sets. I think crucially, I'll just end with the fact that it does something that no other piece of legislation has done, which is also to disapply a key section of the Human Rights Act, which protects all of us, specifically to the people and the people to whom it applies. And I think that's incredibly worrying. And I think, someone in the comments has just said a key thing that I missed out, which is also, Northern Irish organizations have also warned about the Illegal Migration Act, that any attempt to undermine the UK's adherence to its obligations under the ECHR fundamentally endanger the Good Friday Agreement, because the ECHR is baked into it, and thus also endangers peace in Northern Ireland in quite a serious way.
And that was a comment from Tad Cantwell. Another question from David Bowerter, who asked, the UK Parliament already lacks much in the way of checks and balances. Without the European Court of Human Rights, wouldn't that leave us with a parliament with absolute power? How scared should we minorities be? I mean, people sometimes talk about Britain as having an elected dictatorship where you get a concentration of power in the executive. So, for those, for example, members of minorities, David Bowerter, I know is from the LGBTQ community. How worrying is that from that kind of perspective?
I think what we've seen in the past few years is a systematic shutting down of accountability of government, whether that's in the streets through the Police Crime Sentencing at Courts Act and the Public Order Act, to introducing voter ID in the Elections Act, to limiting judicial review in the Judicial Review and Courts Act, to clamping down on the right to strike through the Strikes Act, and many, many more. I could list them if I remembered them. And all of that, in addition to the kind of one of the main centerpieces, which is the Bill of Rights Bill or Rights Removal Bill, which would have repealed the Human Rights Act, which was abandoned, but would have, set us further on this course of erosion of our human rights protections. Plus these threats to take us out of the ECHR and the Illegal Migration Act and all of this. It all is tied together by a thread of fundamental evasion of accountability and also taking away the power of ordinary people to stand up to power. And obviously, it's the people who already in society are marginalized, who lack access to justice, who will be most sharply affected. And so I think it is something that we should all be incredibly worried about and mobilize against, because either all of us have human rights or none of us do. It's something that we have an opportunity now to really build an opposition to, and we need to do that together.
In fact, that was just the final point I just wanted to put to you, actually, which was, I guess, this idea of the thin end of the wedge. I mean, look, obviously I support the rights of refugees and migrants in themselves. I suppose the other point is that how vulnerable and demonized minorities, that when their rights are assaulted, that can actually lead to the erosion of rights for people far beyond those who are specifically targeted and demonized.
I think that's absolutely right. And that has absolutely been the approach of government. We've seen this kind of death by 1,000 cuts approach, whereby the government targets a very specific group, whether that's migrants, including refugees, whether that's people in prison, whether that's people who are criminalized, and, essentially target these groups, minoritized, marginalized groups, for specific erosions of rights that actually fundamentally undermine the entire framework. And indeed, these kind of noises to leave the ECHR being projected through this prism of, quote unquote, stopping the boats, is a really, it really demonstrates that that's the logic, that the the government wants to take us out of a human rights protections that, are the fount of our human rights in this country, in order to pursue this fundamentally cruel, unjust, widely condemned policy that violates our international obligations, essentially for what seems to be kind of, electoral or just kind of politicized reasons, without any kind of evidence or grounding, or indeed any acknowledgement of the serious impact that could have. And indeed, it's already having an impact in terms of the rhetoric, creating a sense of unease and fear amongst people. And it really is something that we need to be really wary of and concerned about moving forward. Because as you say, obviously, we have a duty to be in solidarity with those groups most affected, including migrants, including, I see in the comments, trans people, people who are targeted out for specific erosions of their rights. But more broadly, there is an amount of feeling that, eventually, if we leave the ECHR, we're all affected. Hence why, as I said, either all of us has human rights or none of us do.
Great stuff, June, and really, really clear, and I think really goes into just the wider implications of what's happening here in quite a disturbing way. Liberty just do fantastic work. I've relied several times in columns, media appearances on the brilliant work and research that you all do. So thank you so much for joining us and just very clearly detailing the threat and what it represents. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care. See you in a bit. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great stuff there from June. Now, just what I might do is just talk a bit about the Conservatives more generally in terms of just where they are with the polling. I could just see there quickly FSM the dog. First they came from migrants, then trans, then look, clearly what the Conservatives are doing is going after various minorities. Trans people are at the front line of this. They've clearly, as well as migrants and refugees, focused on one of the most marginalized communities in the country, trans people. I think it is worth noting some of the overlap in some of the way that trans people and migrants and refugees are demonized, because you often get this idea of them being sexual predators, violent threats. There really are often overlaps. Throughout history, it has been the case that you get a false appropriation of the rights of women who face pandemic male violence. We're talking about 1.4 million women who face domestic violence a year, 400,000 women who are sexually assaulted, 85,000 to 90,000 women who are raped a year. And we've seen how campaigns against migrants and refugees, and we've seen some of these protests recently, a few months ago, focused on the idea of, and this was also how Black people in the American South were targeted. This is for the rhetoric of the KKK, to use the very real crisis of male violence against women and girls to focus on, for example, refugees and migrants or Black people in the US South. And that's also happening with trans people. You can just see some of the connections there. And I think it is worth stating that. What I am going to do now is just talk about the Conservative. Oh, sorry, I should say to the other comments. Thank you everyone for all the birthday wishes. Yes, I did turn 23 yesterday. I'm 39. I know some of you hilariously saying happy 40th birthday. You've got a year until you can 40. Oh, what happened? It's funny as you get older, like certain cliches, like life's too short. Then you realise, oh, it is pretty short, actually. I mean, it's just odd. I remember hearing people when they were 40 going like, wow, like it feels like I was only 25 yesterday. It doesn't seem that long ago that I was 25, is all I'm saying. And I remember just the idea of being 40 in my head is just cemented as like those are old people. Anyway, you don't need to hear that. It's funny as well because I spent years people patronizing me about oh, he's so young, how young, in order to not listen to what I was saying. And now, particularly, as you talk about anti-trans people, they're all going, middle-aged Owen Jones, middle-aged Owen Jones. I didn't get the bit in the middle. I was too young and now I'm too old. What happened at the middle bit? Well, I was just the right age. Anyway, it's not that interesting, is it? I just thought I'd just share it with you. Let's just look at this. So Channel 4 did a report on the polling situation facing the Conservative Party, which is pretty bad. So let's just have a listen.
Well, it says that the Conservatives at the moment are facing a bit of a catastrophe. So this is polling given exclusively to Channel 4 News by pollsters at Find Out Now and Electoral Calculus. And it was conducted between the 31st of July and the 4th of August last Friday. So it takes into consideration all the noise and publicity about ULEZ and North Sea drilling and all things, by the way, that the Conservatives, there was a feeling that they were hoping to capitalise on. Looking at these numbers, they will not be happy. So 11,000 people were polled. What they said, if there was an election right now, 24% of voters would back the Conservatives. 46% would back Labour. Conservatives would see their vote share down by 21%, Labour up 13%. The big question, of course, then, what does that mean for the shape of Parliament? Well, that means the Conservatives will be down to fewer than 100 seats, just 90. Labour would have a landslide, a majority, 461 seats. You'd also see a resurgence of the Lib Dems, them fighting with the SNP for second place. You'd also see a few big names lose their seats, notably even the Prime Minister and a few members of his cabinet. Now, look, all the usual caveats apply. It's a poll, things change. There's still possibly a year until the election. However, whichever way you look at these numbers, they are bad for the government. Not
great for the Conservatives, let's be honest with you. They're facing a terrible defeat, I think, as things stand. And I think, obviously, what we're looking at in terms of the assault on refugees and migrants and various cultural attacks, for example, on trans people, that's what's happening. They think if they keep pressing a big red button, whip up bigotry against marginalised minorities, cause a moral panic about trans people, then maybe they'll reconsolidate their base. As I've said, I do think the Stop the Boats so-called campaign is a big, big error on their part. They're not going to stop the boats. I mean, they've shut down legal and safe routes. Rwanda is not, that whole heinous scheme is not going to deter people from coming here. So they're going to end up going into the next election with people still arriving. Like, even if only 10 people a day were arriving or a week, that would still constitute boats arriving. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't matter even if the number decreased. Because actually you could say the numbers have decreased this year slightly because of bad weather. But that they don't get any political dividends from that. They haven't thought it through, is all I'm saying. If you're going to whip up a campaign of bigotry and hatred and fear against migrants and refugees, do it competently. Don't pick an issue where you cannot solve what you've made into a crisis. You've given all this red meat to the Conservatives. You've riled up your own voters about it. You've inflamed their own passions, and then they go, "Well, are you going to solve it?" And you can't do it. I mean, it is utter political ineptitude on the part of the Conservatives. And I think it is worth pointing out, as well as it being obviously immoral and a general all-round disgrace. So I do think myself, in terms of what's happened with the Conservatives, I do think obviously the cost of living crisis is a massive part of what's happened. The fact they've got through two prime ministers, one resigned because of illegality. I mean, the biggest scandal involving a government in democratic history, really. But I do think, for me, I think history will judge that the moment that the Conservatives really couldn't claw things back, because a large section of the electorate decided at that moment, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you promise us. We've made up our mind and we're going to kick you out, was the Liz Truss experiment. I mean, what happened there is the Conservatives got rid of Boris Johnson when they were only actually 7 points behind in polling, which was recoverable. And if they were going to commit regicide, then they should have had somebody lined up who had popular appeal. Instead, what they did is put someone there who supports economic policies, hard right libertarian policies, which about 5% of the electorate support, slashing taxes on the rich, basically big tax giveaways to already extremely rich people during a cost of living crisis, who was a terrible political communicator and just a terrible politician. And what happened then when that caused an economic crisis? So they offered a series of policies which were terrible because people rejected them. So they were unpopular policies. We're going to hand loads of free tax giveaways to the rich. And the consequence of that was to send mortgages going up and to cause an economic crisis. That's the moment when people just decided, we've had enough. We're getting rid of you. It doesn't matter what you do. And I think that's the problem Rishi Sunak faces. You know, that's what happened with Black Wednesday under John Major and Norman Lamont. Just at that point, people just decided it doesn't matter what you do. So, you know, my view on that, as you probably know, is the Conservatives are going to lose the election almost certainly by default, and Labour are going to win, not on their own merits, because Labour aren't offering a inspiring alternative, clearly, or a clear vision whatsoever for the country. But I think it's very clear that was the end for them. They will claw back some of their polling. I think that's very likely, because a lot of the, a significant amount of the Labour lead is down to Tories going, Tory voters, people who voted Tory in 2019 going to don't know. Also, I've seen polls with Reform on 10%, Reform are not on 10%. So a significant number of those are going to go back to the Conservatives, I would say. But I just think the Tories are way too behind now at this point in the electoral cycle. I mean, it's said that an election's penciled in for November. I just don't see how it's plausible how the Conservatives could win a majority. Bear in mind now, they don't really have other they don't have coalition partners. Kieran Buckley says Labour might win the next election, but they will do nothing. Then we're likely to be back under the 20 plus years of Tories. We just can't win. Hold on. My cat, Kia, has a obsession with eating sellotape. I need to stop him doing that because of the work. Once he got hospitalised. 1 second. He's here. Kia, come on. Here, boss. Come on. Oh. There we go. This is a very naughty puss, aren't you? Yeah, he wants he wants 8 cellophane. He inhaled it, and we had to give him a general aesthetic. You just stay here for now. Okay, I think we'll come to the end. I need to look after him, don't I? Thanks everyone for joining. And we will keep doing these as well as our daily videos. I have been away a lot recently. I've been in Germany and stuff. So we've done fewer videos, but you can see at the moment I'm trying to make up for it. I've been doing like 2 videos a day. So we will keep doing that. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for saying happy birthday. Very sweet of you. Oh, hello. And we're going to be doing some interviews as well. Which we've got lined up and approaching some very interesting people off the back of suggestions, which people got on patreon.com/4. We've already started planning now. We've submitted our applications for Labour Party conference. We're doing a video there, as we always do, and for Conservative Party conference, which I am actually very much looking forward to. I don't know if you saw our video at Conservative Party conference last year. Always has a lot of fans. Hopefully this year won't be any different. I'm sure we'll have even more fun. Because this, the election is now approaching. The Conservatives are in an increasingly desperate state, so it'll be very interesting to talk then. Someone says another troublesome Keir. Yeah, but at least my cat's got charisma. That's all I'm saying. Great stuff, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and press like and subscribe. And we've also got our podcast. This will go on the podcast. If you're listening on the podcast, hello, you are valued and loved. Great. All right, everyone, take care. Oh, so what the hell am I doing? I've not said good. Sorry, I just got a very angry message there. Thank you on the super chats to Bob Bold, FSM is the dog, Graham Meacham, State Daft, Tad Cantwell, David Bowerter, FSM is the dog, and Kieran Buckley. And thank you to our brilliant guests as well for their insight, as ever. And do support both of those organisations. They do great stuff. All right, lots of love. Speak soon. Take care. Bye.